Non-binary, also known as genderqueer or colloquially as NB, is a recently emerging identity, both in society and on-screen characterisation. This, as with any representation of the LGBTQ+ community, has led to several issues. Nat Titman defines non-binary as an umbrella term for any gender or lack of gender that would not be adequately represented by an either-or choice between man or woman. This includes agender, androgyne, bigender, and demigender, among many others, each with a unique denotation, view of gender, and lived experience. However, for this video, the umbrella term non-binary will be the main terminology used, unless the text specifies otherwise. It should also be noted that the umbrella term non-binary is considered part of the umbrella term of transgender, although this adds more complexities, which will be addressed in Chapter 2. The actual term non-binary is a relatively recent addition to the English lexicon. Its first academic use is in Felicity Haynes and Tarquin McKenna's Unseen Genders Beyond the Binaries, published in 2001. Also, non-binary individuals account for a small part of the population, with the 2021 UK census indicating that 0.06% are genderqueer. This accounts for why non-binary representation in film and television has been lacklustre. Firstly, there is a recognisable lack of stories about non-binary characters. In their annual surveys, GLAAD identified no non-binary characters in mainstream theatrical releases between 2017 and 2021. This video will specifically focus on fictitious characterisation, including both mainstream and independent examples. Secondly, as Niall Richardson and Frances Smith exemplify, when they do occasionally feature, then these depictions are highly problematic. This can have various dire consequences for audiences watching, and for non-binary people affected by hate speech, harassment, and assaults in public spaces and online. As a non-binary person myself, I personally know the joy from seeing positive representation, and the disgust and shame that negative representation proliferates. Although my subjective experiences will have some effect on my opinions, this video features an objective and qualitative approach to a diverse range of issues, sources, examples, and explanations into why these portrayals are detrimental. Chapter 1 will examine queer theory and homosexuality in the 20th century, and how this has evolved into stereotypes about genderqueer people being snobbish, young activists. Chapter 2 will examine stereotypes regarding the links to transgender people, such as pathetic, deceiving, aliens. Finally, Chapter 3 will discuss the positives and negatives of visibility in reference to queerbaiting and cisnormativity. Although non-binary identities are only recently defined as an identity in Western culture, the notion of more than two genders has been prevalent in many other societies. This includes Two-Spirit in some indigenous North American groups, Fa'afafine in Samoa, Bisu in the Bugis people of Indonesia, Mahu in native Hawaiian and Tahitian cultures, Hiedra in South Asia, as well as many other examples. Susan Kessler and Wendy McKenna emphasise that studying gender categories in other cultures makes gender problematic. That is, uncovers our taken for granted belief in the facility of gender. Although this is true that the wider discourse is not separate from ethno-mythological approaches regarding similar identities in other cultures, I will be disregarding such discussions, as well as texts that are not Anglo-American. This is because, despite the main similarity of not identifying as a man or a woman, each of these identities are distinct from the definition attributed to non-binary. For example, in her autobiography, A Two-Spirit Journey, Mani Chakabi discusses her identity as part of her Adriba Cree culture. Her grandmother, who raised her, noted that Chakabi was Two-Spirit from the age of 4, and how that was something remarkable. She mentions that Two-Spirit individuals used to have special duties in the community. However, times had changed, and they were no longer understood or valued in the same way. Being non-binary in a westernised culture is vastly different to this. Individuals have never been revered in the community, nor experienced this admiration being diminished and the subsequent hardships of being an Adriba Cree two-spirited person. Therefore, As I am writing from a Western non-binary perspective, this is the culture I will be focusing upon. Chapter 1. Stereotyping the political. The arrogant adolescent activist. The negative reactions to non-binary identities are partially the result of stereotypes proliferated in the media. Stereotypes, termed by Walter Lippmann, are generalities, patternings, and typifications used to make sense of the mass of complex and incoherent data that we receive from the world. Often, these are used as conceptual and cultural shorthand to provide a quick judgment on a certain person or group from prior knowledge. These are often negative associations, which have been long-standing assumptions. Lippmann mentions that this means stereotypes are highly charged with feelings that are attached to them. They are the fortresses of our tradition, and behind its defences we can continue to feel ourselves safe in the position we occupy. Furthermore, Orrin Clapp explores, stereotypes emphasise error and refer to things outside of one's social world. Due to these aspects, stereotypes are often most apparent with minority and marginalised groups, created with a long history of intertextuality with prior ideals and discussions, and created by the hegemonic majority who levy fear to those against conservative traditions. The idea of non-binary, as well as the stereotypes and prejudices relating to it, are a product of discourse. Originally theorised by Michel Foucault, discourse relates to the process by which naturally occurring speech or writing is seen from the point of view of the beliefs, values, and categories which it embodies, and how this constitutes an organisation or representation of experience. In other words, communication, whether literal or through media texts, can result in the creation of widely believed ideology. Sarah Mills argues that discourse should be seen as something which constrains our perceptions, because these expressed beliefs affect an individual's judgment on the world around them. Due to the modernity of non-binary people in the public discourse, one's insights and opinions are especially controlled by the discussions they have been inflicted to regarding genderqueer. As Mills further explains, discourses should not be seen as wholly cohesive, since they always contain within them conflicting sets of statements. On one side of the discourse, someone could be educated into the definitions, history, and experiences of non-binary individuals, whilst, on the other, discourse could contain debates about the legitimacy of a gender spectrum, and falsifications about predatory people in cross-dressing disguises to infiltrate opposite gender spaces. In-person communication, social media, news broadcasts, as well as film and television can all affect what messages are being conveyed. However, how somebody responds to specific aspects of the non-binary discourse after their initial exposure depends on their reception to the content. Assuming that audiences are active in their engagement to discourse, rather than passively and unconsciously absorbing all information as fact, Stuart Hall proposes that there are 3 readings that one can occupy. These are the dominant or hegemonic code, when the viewer takes the connoted meaning full and straight, as the filmmaker intends; the negotiated code, whereby one acknowledges the legitimacy of the hegemonic definitions to make the grand significations, while at a more restricted situational level operates with exceptions to the rule; and the oppositional code, in which somebody detotalizes the message in the preferred code in order to retotalize the message within some alternative framework of reference. In this regard, discourse can either be subconsciously accepted, altered, or rejected, depending on the individual's pre-existing ideology. In the subsequent discussion, this video will evaluate stereotypes with prevalence to the negotiated reading. Firstly, this is due to the positive fact that, in texts that feature non-binary characters, it is rare for the filmmakers to overtly intend to criticise the identity. Therefore, this dismisses the dominant reading as a cause for concern. Secondly, however, the use of stereotypes and lacklustre representation are the most adverse when it is assumed that the audience has a baseline knowledge on what non-binary means, but has doubts about the details which surround it. In this respect, stereotypes can bolster negative doubts and opinions, each in a unique way. This can then transpire in these confirmed beliefs being strengthened and imparted to others through future discourse. This is a negotiated reading, as a definition is known but alternative ideology creates a dissonance with the intended message. As a result, non-binary people may be regarded as being activists, snobs, angsty teenagers, pathetic failures, deceiving rapists, or inhuman. When regarding non-binary identity and representation, the primary academic field is queer theory. It cannot be understated that queer theory has a massive influence into the discussions about gender identity outside of the binary. However, there are a couple of problems with using this academic perspective to examine non-binary characters, especially through a constructionist or essentialist perspective. Firstly, viewing it purely in a constructionist perspective, where meaning is created through discourse, means non-binary is seen as being a response from specific social pressures. Viewing non-binary purely in an essentialist perspective, where personal attributes are biologically ingrained into an identity, as Richard Dyer notes, has the risk of seeing identity as the hidden essence of one's being, and simplifies it into being one unified experience. In both regards, this results in the identity being viewed as a dissonance towards hegemonic societal gender roles. In other words, being an activist. Constructionist theories imply that the identity is a conscious choice against binary gender, whilst essentialist theories unify all non-binary people under a common goal of gender dissonance. Both, conscious or unconscious, indicate an idea that rebelling against rigid gender assigned at birth is the primary reason for the identity's existence. The predominant theorist often cited with creating these foundations is Judith Butler. In their 1990 work Gender Trouble, Butler discusses the idea of gender as a binary construct, stating, "There is no gender identity behind the expressions of gender. That identity is performatively constituted by the very expressions that are said to be its result." This gender performativity theory, and the debates that arise from it, have allowed for meaningful conversations and reassurance about defining oneself as not a man or a woman. However, this part of queer theory presents the basis of common negativifications associated with non-binary. The titular Gender Trouble Butler introduces is intrinsically linked to a feminist activism. Butler states in their introduction that the text aims to make gender trouble through the mobilization, subversive confusion, and proliferation of precisely those constitutive categories that seek to keep gender in its place by posturing as the foundational illusions of identity. In other words, deviating from society's idea of how one should act according to their gender, thus performing outside of the gender binary, would create the conditions necessary to cause change. The same effect can be attributed to a different queer feminist theory, that of the gender outlaw or gender terrorist, proposed by Kate Bornstein in 1995. This originally denoted people who deviated from societal gender roles and who were terrorizing the structure of gender itself. These words connote criminality, implying a more extreme and violent reason for these gendered expressions. Susan Stryker notes how these readings have received criticism from transgender people, who consider their sense of gendered self not to be the subject of their instrumental will, not divestible, not a form of play. Suggesting that those under the transgender umbrella exist primarily to cause the public to reflect on their own performed gender negates the subconscious dysphoria and subsequent challenges that individuals do not choose to experience. This gender play is accentuated with gender-fluid characters, due to the dysphoria and euphoria of altering how one presents themselves. For example, in the series Genlock, which is set 50 years in the future, gender-affirming procedure technology is advanced and more accessible. For the character of Val or Valentina, played by Asia Kate Dillon, this means they can change sex multiple times throughout the series, including subconsciously during a mind share, which is an interconnected digital space akin to realistic VR. This occurs as they are having sexual intercourse with Kazu, portrayed by Koichi Yamadara, who also switches bodies as he recently questions his own identity. Although this is a positive for showing the benefits of a euphoric experience, and shows the challenges both Val and Valentina and Kazu have overcome to feel euphoric, the playful nature of the intercourse and futuristic technology may diminish the dysphoric experiences of contemporary individuals without such luxury. However, it is important to mention that these readings were not Butler's or Bornstein's intentions. J. Prosser, in reference to Butler's Gender Trouble, addresses that the embodied subject of the transgender barely occupies the text, and that gender performativity relates to less than 1/12 of the book. Furthermore, Bornstein later retracted the label of gender terrorism to denote gender deviancy, instead attributing the term to the gender defenders who bang their heads against a gender system which is real and natural, and who use gender to terrorise the rest of us. Despite them not being at fault, Butler's and Bornstein's theories have alas unintentionally provided a basis for perpetuated myths. Firstly, various future discussions and misinterpretations about the text have made it an iconography of transgender and non-binary theory, in turn sustaining the concept that Gender Trouble is about queer performativity and activism, rather than the intended feminist reading. Secondly, both Butler and Bornstein have since self-disclosed that they now identify as non-binary, which may add credence to the genderqueer readings of their earlier texts. Regardless, Gender Trouble, Gender Performativity, and Gender Outlaws, in their now often cited non-binary contexts, have proliferated an idea that those who deviate from gender norms are doing so to be activists, with the aim to convert others to join them. An example of this reductionism into politicised activism is noticeable in Sex Education. The comedy drama series features an ensemble cast of teenagers, parents, and teachers, through which issues and advice regarding sex and gender is discussed. Cal Bowman, portrayed by Jura Sala, was introduced in Series 3, and experiences multiple plot lines regarding their non-binary identity. Not feeling like you belong when classes are split into boys and girls, safety advice for wearing binders, and the struggles of dating people who may not be attracted to all gender presentations. Despite this being vital information that is rarely discussed in television, Cal is still overall reduced to being defined by their identity through the focus on the messages. The show partially attempts to avoid portraying Cal as an activist through their refusal to talk about their issues on the student council, instead making their friend, Jackson, portrayed by Keda Williams Sterling, the one who eventually convinces them. However, in Series 3, Cal does not interact with anyone outside of activism-centred stories, and in Series 4, despite being more integrated in groups, Cal's main stories are still about the mental health effects of being genderqueer, partially in relation to not being able to afford top surgery. This results in Carl entering a depressive state and going missing in the final episodes. Furthermore, Carl's personality is very defensive, judgmental, and irritable, such as when they explain the definition of envy to the head teacher, Hope, in a patronising manner, staring at Hope and drawing big letters in the air to explain the NB initials.
So Layla's a good NB, and I'm a bad one. Is that right?
I don't understand your slang.
NB, like non-binary person.
This can perturb audiences from accepting messages, as Carl is represented as a self-centred and frustrated individual who is unaccepting of a person's perceived ignorance regarding modern concepts. Although Carl themselves may reject being an activist, their characterization in reference to the narrative portrays them as a tragic gender outlaw whose mental health is only affected by being genderqueer, which in turn makes them cynical and annoyed. In this regard, the egocentric and snobbish discussions about non-binary and the teenage angst and hormonal depressions that is seen as a cause and consequence of it, assists the negative representation of the genderqueer activist. Although overly essentialist queer theories are detrimental, as they assume all LGBTQ+ people have the same experiences and issues from biological factors, theories about the representation of gay, lesbian and transgender people are still vital to this discussion. This is due to the lack of discussion specifically about non-binary representation, and also the historic portrayals of queerness showing many similarities to modern genderqueer examples. Bornstein mentions that, because gender ambiguity is made invisible in this culture, the defenders of gender rigidity lash out at the nearest familiar label, homosexuality and lesbianism. Stephen Whittle discusses this as originating in the early 1800s, due to the popular perception of gay and transgender people interacting in the same taverns of London, and thus a misinterpretation that cross-dressing was a signifier of homosexuality. It is for this reason that the stereotypes associated with being non-binary in contemporary culture have originated from long-standing cliches of being LGBTQ+ in film and television. The egocentric and self-entitled perception of queerness has been associated with homosexuality throughout the 20th century. Dyer emphasises that homosexuality is often portrayed in relation to gender, particularly ideas of body type, physical and mental weakness, decadence, attitudes of irony, disdain, and propensities towards superficial performance and display. This type of performance integrates non-binary individuals with the stereotype of the gay man as an elitist, one who wears extravagant and excessive clothes and pompously views himself as superior to those not of the same lifestyle. As Dyer discusses, those stereotypes can all be understood as signs of a vein of snobism in the queer personality, whether by virtue of birth or aspiration. Non-binary people epitomise this due to the belief that it is not a real identity, instead being used by people who desire to gain attention via a rude and angry persona against conservative gender ideals. Non-binary people also are typically assumed to wear extravagant clothes, either through the perceived weirdness of transvesticism, questionability of androgyny, or controversial fashion statements, such as those worn by singer-songwriter Sam Smith. An example of this is demonstrated in Zoolander 2. The film focuses on two aging fashion models, Derek Zoolander, played by Ben Stiller, and Hansel, played by Owen Wilson, who are brought out of their 15-year retirement to aid Interpol in finding an assassin. Shortly after the estranged pair reconcile, they participate in a catwalk with new hipster models. One such person they meet is the current superstar, All, played by Benedict Cumberbatch, an androgyne model who uses he/her pronouns. Cumberbatch believes the film aimed to show two heteronormative cliches not understanding this new diverse world. However, this representation uses multiple of the stereotypes Dyer discusses. Due to All being a celebrity, Heesh is shown to have a sense of superiority compared to the main duo, standing close and staring at Derek when he seems uncomfortable about his identity. This is accentuated by All's stubborn and entitled attitude, in which the fact that Herm married himself is used to show that All does not care about anybody else. These issues are highlighted when Derek and Hansel are forced on stage with name tags saying old and lame to be publicly humiliated by All, who is wearing an elaborate evil angel outfit and proceeds to whip the pair while suspended on wires above them. This gives All a literal higher standing than anyone else and demonstrates the perceived elitism Herm has assigned himself. Overall, this emphasises the stereotypes of queer people as vain and attention-seeking compared to the normal protagonists the audience is invited to identify with. However, snobbery is not the only attitude that is displayed by non-binary characters. The idea that this identity is a teenage rebellion and therefore just a phase is also apparent. As it is a new identity, or more specifically terminology, that has developed throughout the 21st century, it has only become prevalent in mainstream discussions in recent years. Therefore, it is yet to be regarded as a lifelong and salient feature of a person's individuality. Furthermore, most non-binary people are young, with 76% being between 18 and 29 years old. This is because there is more accessibility to information about genderqueer identities on the internet, which is more likely to be researched by generations more familiar with online technology. Jack Halberstam emphasises the transgender child is a product of social media, the object of new and public conversations about gender instability. Additionally, there is more acceptability and freedom for young adults to explore and express themselves. Dyer states that youth is important to all queer identity, as it shows a state of transience marked by virtue of the notion of moving between normal and queer worlds, always caught at the moment of exploration and discovery. Therefore, these conditions allow for more self-reflection and self-realisation. Although this means that many older people are likely to identify with non-binary but do not have the means for self-discovery, there is still a skew towards younger generations who have actually adopted the term. As a result, it is often misinterpreted as a youthful fad. Like snobbery, this notion is not limited to non-binary individuals in contemporary culture. Dyer notes how young characters, especially those in the 1940s to 1960s, were portrayed as gay as a narrative obstacle in their coming-of-age story. He mentions, a key aspect of which was the successful transition to responsible adulthood. The possibility that they might turn out queer was one of the dangers along the way. Although this is not as extreme in a modern context, teenagers self-disclosing as non-binary has been portrayed as a threat which has negative altercations on their life, and the lives of those around them. An example of this is shown in the series And Just Like That. This series, a sequel to Sex and the City, features Rock Goldblatt, played by Alexa Swinton, the 12-year-old child of Charlotte, played by Christian Davis, and Harry, played by Evan Handler. Throughout the first season, Rock's newly discovered gender identity is their primary trait, providing tension for the main characters of Charlotte and Harry, who are confused and dismayed by the changes. The foremost pressure arises when Rock opposes their parents' plan for a bat mitzvah, due to no longer identifying as a girl. Their parents painstakingly try to appease Rock, attempting to understand their child's identity, rebranding the event as a they mitzvah, and hiring a transgender rabbi. However, Rock still refuses just as the ceremony starts, again reiterating that they do not relate with any of it. Emma Flint discusses that this event is portrayed as the tantrums of a confused child, and creates a narrative about non-binary and transness that's entitled and unreliable. This represents Rock as a self-obsessed and bratty teenager, which could have been shown as normal, albeit still stereotypical, for someone that age. Although, the strong links to gender identity connote that this attitude is instead predominantly from a dissonance with being cisgender, and as something too complicated and disjointed to be understood by the rest of the cast. This links being non-binary with hormonal mood swings that teenagers display, and thus a biological and empirical obstacle in development that people should eventually stop having as they mature. Implying it is pathological also relates to the medicalisation and categorisation of the transgender community and the subsequent issues they experience. This results in further negative stereotypes. Chapter 2. Stereotyping the queer. Transgender made inhuman. Contrary to the portrayal as activists, non-binary identities are also viewed as part of the transgender community. Simona Giordano discusses the etymology of the term transgender, defining it as beyond trans, birth, gender. Further explaining this embraces all forms of development that are found in gender minorities. Therefore, this is inclusive of genderqueer identities, and there are benefits of this grouping in terms of relatability. Both transgender, in the traditional binary sense, and non-binary identities are something not chosen or changed, and is a part of how a person sees themselves and wants to be seen by others. As well, there is often dysphoria from incongruencies between the internal state and external body, so both may use hormonal replacements and get surgery as a result. Although, there is also understandably a disdain with some people, both trans and non-binary, who note the significant differences. Morgan Lev Edward Holub explains that some non-binary people don't claim transness because they don't have dysphoria and feel like trans implies dysphoria or transition. Alternatively, it might be because they still feel aligned with some part of the gender they were assigned at birth. This signifies that there are different feelings of dysphoria and dysmorphia that should not be combined into one grouping. Using essentialism to associate those that primarily feel uncomfortable in assigned gender roles with those who also feel uncomfortable in their own body diminishes and demeans the unique experiences and struggles people endure. With respect to this debate, many academics are favouring the term trans with an asterisk instead. Eva Hayward and Jamie Weinstein explain the added asterisk. Trans with an asterisk is meant in part to break open the category of transgender, trans woman or trans man, to include all non-cisgender identities. The asterisk is a power tactic. It can be a disclaimer indexing the fine print, and it indicates pseudonyms or names that have been changed. This respects the inclusive etymology, whilst implying there are complexities as well. Therefore, trans is used to denote the whole community, whilst transgender refers to trans men and trans women specifically. Julia Serrano categorises two main prejudicial archetypes of transgender representation: the pathetic and the deceptive. Fortunately, in terms of non-binary representation, the portrayals are not as extremely distasteful as the various transgender examples, which often categorise the character as a psychotic, depraved murderer, or a humorous, floundering transvestite. However, the long history of transgender villains and cross-dressing comedy has an impact on the current portrayals of genderqueer individuals. In terms of the pathetic trans, Richardson and Smith indicate that the character is easily read as the gender they were assigned at birth, and is often coded as a figure of fun. They clarify that laughing at trans people, specifically their non-passing appearance and their personalities as either butch women or cisty men, means that the audience is permitted to laugh at dowdy femininity and is absolved of any guilt that is associated with laughing at women or gay people. An example of this comedy attributed to a genderqueer character is seen in the film The Kings of Summer, which portrays 3 teenagers who disappear from their families and live in a house they built in a forest. One of the trio, Biagio, played by Moses Arias, is agender and acts as the outcast and the comedic relief. Although he's not portrayed as being overtly feminine, as he still does stereotypically masculine things such as construction, machete wielding and play fighting, indicating his assigned gender at birth, he has stereotypically camp qualities. He is seen as weird in his exaggerated movements and stiff posture, overly sensitive, as demonstrated when he strokes the house with remorse after it was damaged, and is the one who befalls most of the practical comedy used in the film. Although, most heinous is the way the film treats his self-disclosure to his friend Joe, played by Nick Robinson.
I don't really see myself as having a gender. Is that a problem?
It's not great.
As well as this, later in the film, Joe and Patrick, played by Gabriel Basso, the other member of the trio, are talking alone when they joke about Biagio again.
All I'm saying is that if anything was missing from all of this, it'd be a woman's touch.
We have Biagio.
Doesn't count.
Both moments imply that Biagio's perceived femininity and lack of desired masculinity is shameful. Richardson and Smith continue to explore the impacts of such portrayals, remarking that this supports trans-exclusionary views that being trans is a selfish practice that is being forced on innocent bystanders who have to endure the trans person's solipsism. Biagio's weird personality, Joe's abandonment of Biagio during his vulnerable moments, and the fact there are no repercussions or further mentions of Biagio's identity reinforces that this was just another comedic moment by a pathetic character failing to meet expectations. The other distinction of being pathetic is depressing tribulations. Lucy Hay remarks how they are often seen as tragic, with death and suicide closely associated with trans characters. She elucidates, while not inauthentic, trans people are more likely to be murdered or commit suicide. It is obviously wary for the LGBT community to always be portrayed in this way. The experience of being non-binary is no different. A study by Bianca Wilson and Elan Mayer states that 53% reported bullying, 55% reported assaults, 94% have considered suicide, and 39% have attempted it. The prevalence of this explains why many filmmakers incorporate it into their work, with varying levels of respect and effectiveness. This may make non-binary people feel like there is no hope for their identity to be accepted, emphasising feelings of loneliness, depression, and distress. Furthermore, Halberstam remarks that being seen as dysphoric and disorientated, rather than being folded into a general postmodern condition, is cast as uninhabitable and pathologically unstable. This implies that the mental health issues are intrinsically linked to the socially unaccepted queerness, and therefore is incurable unless the individual fully dismisses their identity. Although, if the text is not made too cynical in its depiction and provides the non-binary character a meaningful development, then it can be beneficial. Tom Sandercock states, while this may reiterate to implied adolescent audiences the consequences of gender non-conformity, which may implicitly dissuade such ways of being, the text continues to depict characters who, while hurt, do not conform to gender norms. In doing so, these stories endorse the pursuit of a gender-independent life. An example of this is in the short film A Spot for Frog, which depicts the titular teenage Emby, played by Gian Canberra, during a school lunch. Frog does not have any friends, and feels separate from the gendered spaces around them. This has the cynical implication that being non-binary is different and likely to be rejected by peers. However, the film ends with Frog finding a space where they can be themselves, away from other people, except their new friends, the equally socially shunned Lila, played by Emily K. Hernandez. Furthermore, Lila is cisgender, showing it is not just being non-binary that results in social rejection. This shows that it is not the identity that is the cause of concern, and that somebody does not have to fit in completely with the normality to still be respected and feel safe. On the contrary, a trope that does not have any benefits is the deceptive trans. Richardson and Smith states such characters are coded as a source of horror rather than comedy. Like earlier stereotypes of murderous gays and lesbians, the suggestion is that these characters' sexual frustration, their gender liminality prevents them attaining meaningful sexual relationships, has driven them insane. Therefore, they are often the antagonists and a foil to the typically cisgender hero. This is not to say that non-binary characters shouldn't also not be villains. As Hay clarifies, only making minority characters morally good is undiverse, patronising, and lacks variety across all the role function. However, when the identity itself is connoted to be the fatalistic reason for their corrupt behaviour, then this creates deleterious implications. This is an effect of cisgenderism, which Y. Gavriel and Sana defines as a term used to describe discriminatory approaches towards people's self-designated genders and body diversity. This is the replacement for the more commonly used term transphobia. Whereas transphobia implies there is a pathological reason to fear trans people, cisgenderism implies a conscious systematic ideology with societal causes and consequences enforced by some cisgender people. The main critique cisgenderist people advocate against is the allowance of trans people in single-sex spaces, particularly trans women in women's toilets. These views are epitomised by Janice Raymond, who likened trans people, specifically those who appear as a different sex to which they were assigned at birth, to metaphorical and implied literal rapists who penetrate women's minds, women's space, women's sexuality. She also clarifies that a trans person is able to gain entrance and a dominant position in women's spaces because the women involved do not know he is a transsexual and he just does not happen to mention it. The idea proposed by trans exclusionary radical feminists, also known as TERFs, such as Raymond, is that it is merely an excuse to wear a disguise, to have perverse access to single-sex spaces, and lure heterosexual people into what may be considered homosexual acts. These ideas are noticeable in Hedwig and the Angry Inch, which depicts the life of Hedwig, played by John Cameron Mitchell, a rock singer who undergoes a forced sex change operation. Although Hedwig was originally read as a trans woman, the non-binary identification has been retroactively applied. Both the creators, John Cameron Mitchell and Stephen Trask, who have both subsequently self-disclosed as non-binary, mention that the character is not transgender. Mitchell clarifies the film instead talks about androgyny as a kind of holiness, as the film's main thematic focus. Although these transgender stereotypes persist, Hedwig is a person whose gender identity and sexuality defines them, to the point of naming their band The Angry Inch after the remnants of their penis following the botched operation. This overt sexuality is transposed into their music, such as in the song Sugar Daddy, where Hedwig sings about how they are dripping like a honeycomb as they stand on a diner table and thrust their crotch into the face of an unsuspecting man. This is sexual harassment, and could be viewed by TERFs as an invasion of women's sexuality, using deceptive drag-inspired outfits. Furthermore, as revealed in flashbacks, Hedwig had a romantic relationship with Tommy, a teenager Hedwig babysat, who believed Hedwig was fully female. When the couple initiates sex, Tommy reaches into Hedwig's underwear and immediately recoils, asking in shock,
What is that?
After Hedwig ambiguously explains, Tommy tries to leave, but is stopped by Hedwig shouting and attacking him. Raymond mentions that transsexuals merely cut off the most obvious means of invading women so that they seem non-invasive, and that is shown to be similar in luring men as well. Therefore, Hedwig is depicted as a conniving person who purposely hides their identity to perform sexualized acts on various unsuspecting people. Overall, this implies that trans people do not technically exist, and it is instead a conscious decision or delusion to cross-dress to achieve these perverse fantasies. The final issue that is often mentioned is the process of transface, which Hay defines as the notion of non-transgender actors playing characters some advocates believe should be played by actors who are trans in real life. This is often further associated with cisgender actors using over-exaggerated makeup to appear overtly transgender. The same has been implemented for non-binary characters, and may be embellished more to emphasise the gender difference. The most prominent example is Benedict Cumberbatch as All in Zoolander 2. The makeup implemented creates an alien appearance through a pale skin tone, long hair and shaved eyebrows. In conjunction with the uncomfortable acting of robotic head movements, unblinking stare, agape mouth and frequent voice tone shifts, this makes the character feel like they are inhuman compared to the other characters. In discussions about transface, Melanie Cohen mentions the stereotype of the illegal alien, whose trans identity intrudes into a territory of white masculinity where the character doesn't belong. Through the lens of the cisgender protagonists, All is trespassing on what was Derek and Hansel's domain. This insinuates that genderqueer individuals are unbelonging in society due to them being visibly different and having an outcasted personality in opposition to the threatened white masculine hegemony. This alienation of transgender characters has evolved into a stereotype more specific to non-binary characters. The fact that a notable number are non-human as well. Alex Henderson defines this as dehumanizing transgender identity by associating it with monstrosity or otherworldliness. Commonly, this occurs as a narrative device to portray a non-human character as having a different culture, biology or ideology that makes them strange, misunderstood and outcasted to the juxtaposed normal human characters. Christine Prevas states that, in this way, non-binary identity becomes a specific indicator that a character is not human, a distinct marker that sets them apart from humanity, where their appearance might not. Examples include demons in The Sandman, an alien in Zombies 3, and a fairy in the 2021 version of Cinderella. In all these examples, the actors appear human with limited CGI and practical effects. The denotation that these characters are not human are instead stereotypical signifiers of non-binary identities. Short and dyed hair, alternative and flamboyant clothing, and they-them pronouns. In this regard, these are used as cultural shorthand to simultaneously imply a character is genderqueer, and that they are also not as human as they appear. Furthermore, it becomes a signifier of deviation and uncanniness compared to the typically cisgender human protagonists. This has the adverse effect of diminishing identifications for non-binary people. A.A. MacDonald discusses the idea of gender unintelligibility, which is a sense of not being able to understand their gendered experience because the words to describe it did not exist within the available discourse. As they further elucidate, as one condition for being considered human is adherence to one of two binary gender categories, non-binary people are explicitly excluded within mainstream discourse. This affects both non-binary and cisgender individuals, as the former finds it difficult to express their identity without feeling like they are weird, different and subhuman, and then will find it difficult to define it to the latter with clarity and without judgment. As well as this, non-human characters often imply horror and a fear of the unknown, relating to the deceptive trans stereotype. As an example, the antagonist in Futurama The Beast with a Billion Backs is an alien called Yevo, voiced by David Cross. Although presented in a comedic setting, the implication of the character suggests similar ideals to extreme horror portrayals of transgender people. Yevo, whose pronouns are shklim, is a massive tentacled alien from another dimension who non-consensually attaches Sklee's appendages to everyone in the universe. This attack is portrayed using genre conventions of horror, with characters running and screaming. After being touched, they are assimilated into a hive mind, which is portrayed as a religious cult, through the inclusion of a church where the infected congregate, and the pope-like robes that Fry, voiced by Billy West, the appointed leader, adorns. During one of these meetings, Leela, voiced by Katie Sago, the only non-converted individual who has snuck in, reveals that the tentacles are actually genitalia, and that Yevo is attempting to mate with everyone. As a result, a rebellion starts and Yevo is forced to retreat. This combines both the activist and predatory trans stereotypes, examined in previous chapters. Although this is all attempted to be used for comedy, the underlying narrative is a non-binary alien who rapes everyone in the universe and creates a cult. Not only does this suggest that genderqueer is something not of our universe, but it is so different that it results in violations of body and mind without remorse. However, there is also an argument for the positives of making non-binary characters not human. If it allows for a character to be inferred as non-binary, it may allow for a way to discuss genderqueer messages and avoid censorship. Henderson explains that they might skirt past censors concerned about more explicit depictions of queer content, particularly regarding media aimed at young people, allowing portrayal of non-binary identity to reach wider audiences and providing this vision of possibility to audiences who would not have seen it at all otherwise. This is illustrated in the animated series Ridley Jones, which is aimed at preschoolers. One of the main characters is a bison called Fred, voiced by non-binary actor Iris Menas. The show uses this character to discuss gender identity issues, such as in the episode Bison Ball, Series 2, Episode 1, when Fred, who is assigned female, does not want to wear a dress to the prom, and instead wears a suit with the support of their friends. Menas praises this representation, stating, "You can't know what gender an animal is by looking at it. There's something so beautiful about boiling something down for a child to understand." This still allows for representation that can provide education without a fear of backlash. The show's controversial cancellation emphasises this, as in Happy Herd Day, Series 5, Episode 8, Fred does self-disclose as non-binary with they-them pronouns. The subsequent outrage from parents who believed it was a forced agenda resulted in Netflix discontinuing production. In this regard, stereotypes allowed for inferred representation of a character's identity without providing visibility that could annoy cisgenderist people. Consequently, this asks the question of whether visibility is necessarily good for representation at all. Chapter 3. Disregarding stereotypes by disregarding identity. Can NBs ever just be? A lack of visibility provides both a respite and complications for representation, the most detrimental forms being tokenism and queerbaiting. These aspects are the result of cisnormativity. Based on the idea of heteronormativity, which refers to the portrayals of gay characters, Lisa Duggan describes this as a politics that does not contest dominant heteronormative assumptions and institutions, but upholds and sustains them while promising the possibility of a demobilised gay constituency and a privatised, depoliticised gay culture anchored in domesticity and consumption. Essentially, this is the inclusion of overly normal, bland, and dismissed queer characters, so hegemonic audiences will assume that they are cisgender, whilst queer audiences may be able to infer the character's identity due to specific typifications. However, these signs are also simplified and altered to fit the genderqueer identity into a cisgender viewing. MacDonald states, "Existing in a world that makes space only for those who fit into one of two binary gender categories means that non-binary people are forced to draw on binary gender norms in order to live as social beings. Therefore, non-binary people are categorized as expressing androgyny, simply being shown to do both masculine and feminine things, to convey that they are genderqueer, rather than portraying any realistic experiences or culture. This is purposefully creating a negotiated coding of the character, as the filmmakers intend for the character to be misread by cisgender audiences and misinterpreted as positive inclusion by queer audiences. As a result, this alienates both sides from meaningful discussions. The process of aiming to achieve this dual negotiated reading, at its most extreme level of implicit inclusion, is referred to as queerbaiting. Hollow discusses this is when a character's queerness is hinted at for the cynical purpose of attracting a queer audience, which is starved of representation, but the character will never be fully realised as queer, and may be revealed to be straight or cis after long plot lines suggesting otherwise. Hollow reiterates that this contributes to the idea that queerness is unpopular and impossible to represent outside of niche special interest media. This makes queer audiences feel disappointed and shameful, as inclusion is teased but ultimately disregarded. The most prevalent instance of this in the non-binary context is the titular character in Loki, portrayed by Tom Hiddleston. In the Norse mythology the characters are based on, Loki is a god with the ability to shapeshift, and who frequently inhabits various bodies and lives of both male and female people and animals. Although not denoted as gender fluid, due to the modernity of such terms, Rebecca Bell, Zhong Lao, and Eleanor Tremere clarify, within the context of the time, Loki very much exhibits gender fluidity in perhaps the most essential way, because they literally do shift between genders and have been seen as both a man and a woman. For the Marvel Cinematic Universe, also known as the MCU adaptation of the character, many expected this to be explored, as the character had their fluidity alluded to in previous films. For this reason, when the trailer showed Loki's documents listing his gender as fluid, many assumed its inclusion in the promotion would indicate a plotline exploring it. This was further bolstered by the creator, Michael Waldron, saying, "I know how many people identify with Loki in particular, and are eager for that representation. We worked really hard." However, this was not the case, and the clip used in the trailer was the only reference to it in the show itself. Not only was this a disappointment to the false hope, but it emphasises the idea that non-binary is still a taboo topic in mainstream media, especially considering the success and precedence the MCU has in contemporary culture. A single and barely noticeable shot which confirms gender fluidity does not provide any meaningful progress. Unless the audience has read the promotional discussions, queer individuals will not realise there is an identification, and cisgender audiences will not be educated on the idea. This epitomises the process of cisnormativity, making an unsatisfying and shameful attempt to advertise and appeal to a queer demographic, whilst not promoting an ideology to anyone else. Effectively, these aspects, as well as any representation that does not explicitly mention the character's identity, can be considered as connoted visibility. Conan states that visibility always encompasses two processes, being identifiable and recognisable on the one hand, and identifying/recognising on the other. However, therein lies the issue with the representation of non-binary characters, or any LGBTQ+ character. Unlike other representations, such as of women or people of colour, queerness must be directly denoted to the audience, otherwise it may be misinterpreted as something else. Dye discusses regarding gay representation. A major fact about being gay is that it does not show. There is nothing about gay people's physiology that declares them gay, no equivalence to the biological markers of sex and race. The same applies to being non-binary, as a major aspect of the identity is that biology does not dictate gender. Dyer further states that, due to this, typification is a near necessity for the representation of gayness. This is visually recognisable signifiers that are not just something wished on gay people, but produced by them, and something that connotes visibility without explicitly stating it. This includes the subtle use of pronouns, pride flags, and androgynous appearances that may imply someone is genderqueer, but only to those who realise it. Although, simply connoting visibility has issues. Firstly, non-binary is a diverse identity, with people presenting themselves with various degrees of masculinity, femininity, and androgyny, regardless of sex assigned at birth. Therefore, a unified typification is impossible and thus not noticeable. Secondly, due to cisnormativity, the ability to recognise this is not obvious, making the character invisible to those who refuse to acknowledge the legitimacy of non-binary. Conan states, "The screening process leads to the assumption that everyone is heterosexual until proven otherwise. As this is the dominant cisnormative reading, it is presumed that the character is cisgender and heterosexual, and any queerness and quirky behaviour is more likely to be attributed to homosexuality before someone formulates the character to be genderqueer. Therefore, many people, such as J. Wallace Skelton, advocate that it's not enough to have gender-independent and trans children. We need to celebrate such children and give them narratives of their own." This is apparent in the film Joyride, which is a raunchy comedy that portrays four Asian American friends on a hapless trip to China where they confront their own repressed personalities. One of the main characters is Deadeye, played by Sabrina Wu, an outcast to their family and someone who is anxious to make friends offline as they have no sense of self. They are referred to as a woman throughout the film, aside from in the final scene, set a year after the road trip, when another character refers to them as they once. Wu states the lack of a discussion is a positive, as it more accurately reflects reality, whereby identity does not need to be a defining discussion. They state, usually when you know someone who is a gender non-conforming, they take she, her, and then one day they don't. However, for a cis-normative audience, this character development is overshadowed by the more prevalent themes of sex positivity for women, expressed by the other main characters. Lolo, played by Sherry Cola, wants to make provocative art. Audrey, played by Ashley Park, needs to enjoy a sex life over her work, and Kat, played by Stephanie Hsu, is trying to feign celibacy for her Christian boyfriend, despite her previous promiscuous lifestyle and permanent tattoo on her vulva. These plots reach a climax with a montage of these characters enjoying sexual pleasure. In contrast, during this, Deadeye is shown to be engaging in a dance competition. This implies that they are asexual or sexually repressed, hence them being different from the rest of the group. This is further emphasised in the last shot of the film that reveals Deadeye has since also acquired a vulva tattoo. This more significant altercation in the characterisation, compared to a different pronoun, means that the sex-positive motif is assumed to be Deadeye's development into a more confident individual. Audiences who do not have a reflective view on gender are unlikely to recognise the singular use of a change in pronouns, and thus misread the filmmaker's intended coding to portray a confrontation of gender dysphoria and stigma. On the contrary, it could be argued denoting identity would have an adverse message, and that instead implying it using signifiers and pronouns is better for the character and plot. John Wick Chapter 3, Parabellum, is an example which benefits from not clarifying the character's identity. The film portrays John Wick, played by Keanu Reeves, fleeing from other assassins after a bounty is placed on his head for the murder of a crime lord. Wick is pursued by the Adjudicator, played by Asia K. Dillon, a bureaucratic but ruthless judge who works for the crime syndicate. The Adjudicator is non-binary, although this is not mentioned in the film, and is only indicated through appearance and the use of singular they pronouns. The reason for the character's identity is due to the casting of Dillon, who is non-binary themselves, and recommended the removal of gendered pronouns to add a little more mystery. As the character was not written to be non-binary, nor was the film written to explore identity as a theme, it is understandable that this is connoted visibility. The character's role as a villain who excels at their job is their defining trait. To then denote them as non-binary would not enhance the plot or character, and would suggest that being genderqueer is associated with a cold and menacing persona. As well as this, there is an argument against explicit visibility due to the consequences of backlash to representation. As explicit depictions of marginalised characters increase, so too does hate speech, assaults, and homicides, as those against the identities feel more empowered to stop a perceived woke takeover. Raina Gossett, Eric Stanley, and Joanna Burton describe this as the trap of the visual, whereby representation increases awareness for all people, non-binary individuals, those questioning their gender identity, cisgender people who are supportive and want to educate themselves, as well as cisgenderists who are adamantly against gender expressions. As mentioned in Chapter 2, Ridley Jones had this fate, where the character had several stories about exploring gender, thus connoting visibility, but when in the 5th series they self-disclosed as non-binary, the backlash resulted in its cancellation. Overall, the choice to define a character's identity depends on whether the risk of retaliation is more severe than the disappointment of idealised cisnormativity. This depends on the text's tone, themes, and demographic. Conclusion. Not an end-all for NBs. In conclusion, this video has explored various issues about queer representation for non-binary characters. It has been established that making the character's identity too overt means their identity is given too much precedence, risking humanity being masked by stereotypes of alternative clothes, snobbery, youthful angst, activist messages against gender, pathetic jokes, sexually deceptive behaviour, and allusions to dehumanisation. Although, making the character's identity too covert means non-binary as a concept does not have a wider reach, instead being perceived as a queer-baiting marketing ploy that is easy to misinterpret. This balance is exceedingly difficult to achieve, due to the reality that the complications are a result of ingrained prejudices, cisnormativity, and cisgenderist negotiated readings. As a result, many believe that explicit representation should cease, until politics, news, and society in general becomes more educated and accepting of the gender spectrum. However, regardless of how a hegemonic, cisnormative, or cisgenderist viewer may interpret a character, there are still queer individuals and allies who will benefit from good representation. It is therefore important to mention that, despite this video's pessimism and negative examples, good characterization does exist. Firstly, minor flaws do not always outweigh the positives that an audience with a dominant reading can receive. Despite the issues with examples such as sex education and Ridley Jones, both can still be considered good representation due to the filmmaker's intention to discuss non-binary, explore the experience of gender dysphoria, and crucially challenge the taboo of talking about this politicised and controversial identity. These discussions will have many beneficial effects for a variety of queer, questioning, and cisgender audiences. Secondly, other series, such as Billions and Feel Good, have also proven that stereotypes can be avoided, identity can be mentioned and respected, but that this is not the defining trait of the character. In future videos, I will aim to research, discuss, and explore the positive examples and how it is achieved in more depth. Entertainment, specifically fictional film and television, allows for a different context to portray and present non-binary characters outside of the moral panic championed by the non-fictional news and politics. Fictional characterization is aided by its informality and its integration into wider culture. If the identity is written with an understanding of the dangers of stereotyping, the dangers of visibility, and the benefits that may result from it, all in a safe context which allows for education whilst not feeling as if the text is forcing an agenda, then explicit representation may persist. By being aware of the aspects mentioned in this video, and knowing how to avoid them, representation can be relatable, supportive, and educational to non-binary people or anyone else who does not succumb to sensationalist, cisgenderist ideologies. Overall, queer representation has shown various avoidable tropes prevalent in our culture, and, even if, unfortunately, the industry cannot control the backlash they may receive, that should not outweigh the positive effect that better and more prevalent future non-binary representation will create.